So who is C-SAF? So essentially, in 2021, the Canadian airline operators noticed that there was no single point of contact or reference for SAF in Canada. And so in February of 2022, C-SAF was launched. And basically, we are a nonprofit industry-led organization. And besides the airlines, we also have a number of stakeholders. So that includes fuel refiners, airports, OEMs, technology. We've really tried to include companies and organizations who we feel would be able to advance SAF in Canada and who have also shown an interest to do so. Now, our mission is simple, but it is ambitious. We want to essentially get SAF production going in Canada. In June of 2023, we released a roadmap with a target of 1 billion liters by 2030. And we've laid out the steps in that roadmap on what we should be doing now in order to reach that target. Now, besides the roadmap, a big component of our work is advocacy. You can move to the next. Yes, so we have our what we call our SAF policy North Star, and it's basically composed of these 4 pillars. So the first one we have is reduced aviation emissions. A number of industry reports have shown that in order for aviation to reach its net zero target of 2050, we need to use about 65% of SAF into the flights. Obviously, our next pillar would be to make it here in Canada. We feel that if aviation is prioritized, we have all the right ingredients to do so. And this was also shown in our roadmap from 2023. Next, we also want to keep the sector competitive. As many of you know, SAF can be 2 to 5 times more expensive than regular jet fuel. And so any sort of policy has to basically reflect cost competitiveness for that SAF. And then finally, we want to activate Canadian feedstocks. Again, as I mentioned before, we have a number of ingredients here: biomass, cheap electricity. We essentially feel that we have all the necessary components in order to create SAF in Canada. Before I jump into CORSIA and ICAO, I just wanted to mention that we have a few additions to our website. If you go under our work, we have, so the first we have is our roadmap from 2023, which is available in French and English. We also put out a number of briefs concerning SAF topics with a Canadian context, also available in French and English. And finally, we have 2 economic impact studies that we've included there as well. One of them is for the province of British Columbia. And then we also have a national economic impact study that you can see there. Yes, so CORSIA is basically was created by ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, which was basically funded in 1944 as Canada as one of its founding members. And their headquarters are actually situated right here in Montreal. And then basically they set the global aviation standards for safety, security, efficiency, as well as environmental protection. So the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation was created in 2016. And that's the topic that Susan will go into in just a few short minutes here. And I also wanted to mention that since 2022, there's also another program called ACT-SAF, which stands for Assistance, Capacity Building, and Training for Sustainable Aviation Fuels. And they're responsible for things such as SAF feasibility studies in developing countries. They also do a lot of training. They have some good webinars on their website on various topics, SAF topics, which I highly recommend. And then they also just foster cooperation between member states as well. And C-SAF has been a partner since 2023. So we really try to keep on top of everything that ICAO puts out. So next we have our speaker, which is Susan Van Dyke, and she's an expert in the field of sustainable aviation fuels and biofuels with 18 years experience. Susan's expertise includes an in-depth understanding of the technologies for SAF production, their potential and challenges, and research and commercialization trends. She is also experienced in feedstocks, pre-treatment processes, co-processing of bio-based feedstocks in petroleum refineries, refinery integration, policy, and sustainability. She is the author and co-author of numerous influential reports focusing on the application of biofuels and SAF in transportation sectors. These reports were commissioned by organizations such as the International Energy Agency Bioenergy Task 39, the International Renewable Energy Agency, Natural Resources Canada, and Transport Canada. She has also published many highly cited academic papers. She has worked on several SAF projects funded by Boeing, and she is an active reviewer for the US Department of Energy. Other clients include Pratt & Whitney Canada, Deloitte, Sustainable Aviation Futures, ICF, and ourselves, C-SAF. She recently completed a feasibility study on SAF in India as a consultant for ICAO. Susan holds a doctorate in biochemistry and a master's degree in law. She works as a consultant and is also a research associate at the University of British Columbia. Welcome, Susan. You can go ahead with your presentation.
Thanks, Juliana. So today I'm going to talk about CORSIA, as Juliana mentioned. We're going to look at what is it, how does it work, what do these offset obligations mean, and importantly, how does this link in with SAF, which is called CORSIA eligible fuels, and we're going to just look at what that means, and then looking at SAF versus offsets and how these two interact. So CORSIA is a market-based policy mechanism. It was adopted in 2016 to target the reduction of CO2 emissions from international flights. So it only applies to international flights where there's an airplane is taking off in one state and landing in another. So domestic flights are not included, and this is flights between two aerodromes in the same country or state, which is outside the scope of CORSIA. But CORSIA follows a route-based approach, so I will show you that not all countries belong to or fall under CORSIA, because there are some exemptions. So CORSIA's approach is based on routes. If there's a takeoff between two different states that are both in part of CORSIA, then that is counted. But if there's a flight between a state that is not under CORSIA, then that flight is excluded. So it can be quite technical and complicated. So how it works is that the basic principle is that aircraft operators, airlines, must purchase carbon credits under the scheme from approved markets to compensate for any growth of emissions in above a baseline level, which was supposed to be an average of 2019-2020, but because of COVID, that baseline was changed and 2020 was excluded. So only 2019 was used for the pilot phase of CORSIA from 2021 to 2023 at 100%. And then from 2024, the baseline was considered to be 85% of 2019 emissions. So we're going to go back into that in more detail. That's just the outline. And so it's market-based because in essence, it is increasing the cost of emissions and thereby trying to encourage or force behavior to reduce emissions. So the International Civil Aviation Organization, IATA, and many organizations in the international aviation sector has committed to net zero by 2050. And carbon offsets under CORSIA play an important role towards that goal. This is an older graph from IATA, which illustrates quite clearly how offsets fit into this. So basically, to achieve net zero, it is recognized that there has to be a basket of measures and each contributing a portion of the emission reductions that we need. So the blue is SAF, which has to contribute the biggest part. Then we have the red, which is new technologies. So this could be winglets on planes to reduce fuel use. It could be new planes, new engines that reduce fuel consumption, or even hydrogen or electric planes. But it's recognized that this will play a limited role. Then we also have infrastructure and operations, so air traffic management and so on, optimized routes, quicker landing and offtake to reduce fuel consumption. And then the orange one is really the offsetting, or which can be through purchase of offsets or carbon capture. So this was, I think, from a year or two ago for IATA, where they showed that offsets from CORSIA will have to contribute about 19%. But the reality is that this is actually a little bit of a moving target, because as we see that SAF is developing at a slower pace than expected, whether we will be able to achieve the volumes that we need by 2050 is, there's no certainty about it, and therefore offsets may have to play a bigger role. So because SAF can be used to meet some of those offset obligations, they are actually interconnected, and we'll see how CORSIA regulates this under its framework. So originally, CORSIA was really just developed for offsets. And when they realized, okay, you can actually use SAF to meet some of those offset obligations, then they started to develop these rules and regulations for SAF. So what exactly do we mean by carbon offsets and offsetting? So offsetting is an action by a company or individual to compensate for their emissions by financing a reduction in emissions elsewhere. So buying offsets reduces emissions outside the aviation sector. It doesn't reduce the emissions of the aviation itself. So it can be sourced from diverse types of project activities, for example, renewable energy projects, and there are special offset providers or brokers where you can go and then purchase these offsets. And this is nothing new. It's been in operation for probably decades or already. But CORSIA now has special rules and regulations for what they call eligible emission units, where there are special rules. Only approved brokers can be used, because a key consideration is the integrity of the offset, and the aviation sector wants to ensure that these are good offsets, that they have high credibility, so that it doesn't just look like greenwashing. So CORSIA has a phased implementation. So we've already finished the pilot phase, which was from 2021 to 2023, and this was on a voluntary basis. But basically, this just really encompassed monitoring, reporting, and verification. So ICAO under CORSIA put up the system where all airlines that perform international flights must monitor their CO2 emissions where they exceed 10,000 tons annually. And then they must submit these reports, and it must be verified. So there's a whole database for all these emissions reports. Originally, with the pilot phase, when CORSIA was developed, obviously they didn't know that COVID was going to happen. So in this pilot phase, because of the low flight numbers and so on, we'll see there were no offsets that were incurred. So this is why it's really was the monitoring, reporting, and verification, which goes into a specific register in CORSIA, which allows them to actually then calculate what are the emissions and when do the airlines have to buy these offsets. So the first phase, running from 2024 to 2026, starts the offsetting and reduction, and this is still voluntary. So states can volunteer to comply. Most of the states have actually volunteered, and therefore currently in this phase, probably 85% of all international flights are already under the auspices of this first phase. So in this phase, operators between participating states must comply with CORSIA offsetting requirements. I apologize about the duplicates there. And then we will go on to the second phase, 2027 to 2035, which will be compulsory participation for all states, except for the least developed states, landlocked developing states, and small island developing states. So CORSIA was initially only seen as a temporary phase up till 2035, after which it was expected that SAF will be in place to provide the reductions. So CORSIA was originally just to achieve carbon neutral growth, and it was envisaged after that CORSIA would not be necessary. But of course that picture has changed a little bit, but up to at this point we only have up to 2035. So this shows in 2025 the CORSIA participating states, the volunteers in green. Then from 2027, it's compulsory, unless you are exempted, it's compulsory to become part of CORSIA. And this will then include Brazil, Russia, India, China, and so on. And then in yellow, we've got the states that are exempt from CORSIA and they haven't volunteered. So if you are exempt, you can still volunteer. And then the two dots in red shown here, and I don't know if you can see the pointer, but Guyana and Malawi in 2025, they were the only places where you could actually buy authorized credits from projects. There has been developments, and I'll come back to that. So the pilot phase, as I said, was basically about monitoring, reporting, and verification. So regardless of whether you are exempted or not, there is some level of recording that has to take place. So exempted states are still obligated to report on emissions. So above 10,000 tons of CO2, they are reporting. There are third-party verification bodies that ensures the data integrity, so it has to be approved, these reports. And there's a CORSIA central registry, which is a transparent global registry where all of these reports will be recorded so that you can go and see what the emissions are. The first phase is really where the offsetting requirements are commencing because of COVID. This is sort of starting later than expected. So operators flying between CORSIA participating states must purchase and retire approved offsets to compensate for emissions above the baseline. Sorry, I said year 2020, but obviously it's now 2019. And the eligible offsets must meet strict criteria, including additionality, permanence, and independent verification to ensure real environmental benefits. The second phase is expected to have a continuous improvement and long-term review. So on a 3-year period basis, there is reviews carried out to incorporate new science, technology, and industry realities. And this will be mandatory for all states meeting these thresholds. So it will be broader coverage. At this stage, it's not clear what's going to happen after 2035. So how are these emissions calculated? So it's based on fuel use for each individual international flight. The emissions are calculated based on an emission factor of 3.1 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of Jet A or Jet A1. And then the emission growth is based on 85% of the 2019 emissions. So this just shows you, this is from ICAO, this was the 2019 emissions in million tons, and this was 2020 to 2024, and this is the 85% baseline. So in the first phase, pilot phase, all of the emissions were below the 2019 baseline. And then from 2024, the 85% baseline will now kick in. So what is above this will then have to be offset. And the offset obligations are based on the growth against baseline, but there's a distinction between the sector factor growth and the individual growth factor. So, and this is shown here at the bottom. So for the first period, so let's just explain what is the sector growth factor. So this is the growth of the global average emissions in a given year, and it's applied as a common factor for all individual operators participating in the scheme. And ICAO, because it keeps track of all the CO2 emissions, it will calculate the sector growth factor every year, and then it's published by ICAO. So for the initial phases up to 2032. So I think this is blocking. So 2021 to 2023, 24 to 26, 27 to 29, and 2030 to 32, and then 2033 to 2035. So let me just unpack this. Although individual airlines submit their emissions based on their international flights, those are not considered for the growth factor on an individual basis until 2033. So up till end of 2032, it will be 100% sectoral. So if one airline is growing at a faster pace in terms of their international flights and therefore their emissions, it contributes to the overall sector growth, but the individual growth of the airline will not be considered until 2033, and even then, only 15% of the individual growth will be considered, and 85% will still be a sectoral growth factor. So for the initial period from 2021 to 23, the growth factor was 0, and then ICAO published the 2024 sector growth factor, which was just under 16%, and they will then publish the 25 one. But basically what it means is that for 2024, the growth was for 16% above the 85% of 2019, and therefore every ton of CO2 above that baseline, up to 16% of that, will now be an obligation in terms of offsets that airlines have to purchase.
And
Now these, yeah,
Susan, just before we move on, I just wanted to mention that IATA has usually provides forecasts for the SGF. And they mentioned that for 2025, their forecast was between 16.1 and 20.9. And then they were also discussing for 2026, but they were saying that they're not venturing into any forecasts for this year because of, you know, the whole, I guess, global economic situation. They were saying that it's very hard to predict, you know, all the flight paths and everything. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that IATA usually
okay.
comes out with predictions, and they do have one for 2025.
Thanks, Juliana.
Welcome.
So CORSIA has compliance cycles and due dates, and this is quite important because, and the one I've outlined in red, as you can see, it's 24, 25, 26, but only at the end of November 2027 will airlines be notified of the final offsetting requirements. And the cancellation of emission units only needs to be done by 31 January 2028. So what this means is that airlines who have been incurring these obligations for offsets since 2024 will only have to show that they've bought them by end of January 2028. So there's growth all the time, and there are obligations being incurred, but the airlines don't have to actually have purchased them until January 2028, which kind of creates this delayed effect, which I think is impacting things, and we'll take a look at that in a bit more detail. So we don't know. There's some information published on the ICAO database about SAF being purchased, and I think there's some about offsets being purchased, but we don't know with individual airlines at all what they've been purchasing and how many offsets they've already purchased. So there are different organizations that have been looking at what is the projected demand and supply of these CORSIA offsets, and clearly it is expected that a shortfall will be likely. So because of that, we know that 16% growth, we can already see that there's going to be a big demand of 146 to 236 million tons of CO2 offsets. And the second phase, there's also projections, but the current authorized supply is only 32 million tons at the moment. And we're going to go deeper into that, why it's so small. And the potential total supply is expected to increase. But if you look at the projected shortfall, this is quite substantial. So what we know is that under CORSIA, airlines will have to purchase offsets based on these sector growth factor. And at this stage, there is not enough offsets. And even by January 2028, there is likely going to be quite a large shortfall of offsets available for airlines to purchase. And this is going to become relevant in terms of, is this going to be driving the purchase of SAF or not? And we'll get to that. So when we look at the eligible emissions units, as you know, carbon offsets have been around for a long time, but CORSIA now has their own rules to make sure that the integrity of the offsets are clearly established and that this is not a greenwashing. So the eligible emission units must demonstrate additionality, permanence, make provision for leakage and double counting. So additional means that it must be additional to business as usual activity. So The question is, would the activity have occurred holding all else constant were the activity not implemented as an offset project, or would the project have happened anyway? And then offsets must also represent a permanent reduction of emissions that cannot be reversed, and the activity must generate offsets and should not result in unintended increase in emissions elsewhere. And then further, that double counting must be prevented, so it cannot be counted twice. And one type of double counting is double use. If the same emissions unit is used twice by the same operator to attain different mitigation requirements or pledges. Now, where this becomes really relevant is when we start looking at the Paris Agreement and CORSIA, because ICAO is separate from the Paris Agreement because international aviation and international shipping, it does not fall under the United Nations Conference of the Parties, UNFCCC, because it's international. So countries belong to the UNFCCC, but international sectors, the aviation and shipping, falls outside of that, which means that under the Paris Agreement, countries have committed to nationally determined contributions, how they are meeting the Paris Agreement, and that is separate from ICAO and the obligations there. And we'll see what the impact is of that. But it means that if you have offsets through a certain project, you cannot use it twice for pledges or requirements under the Paris Agreement and then under CORSIA. And this is where the whole issue of CORSIA eligible units come in. So because each host country, to avoid this double counting, each host country where there is an offset project must issue a letter of authorization to say that offsets from that project may be eligible under CORSIA. And this is to avoid the double counting. So if there's no letter of authorization, you can have a carbon offset project, but it's not eligible under CORSIA, even if it meets all the other CORSIA criteria. So originally, as I showed on a previous slide, only Guyana and Malawi had 2 projects. Now we have projects in Gambia, Laos, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and Tanzania. So currently there are about 32 million eligible emission units, so this is part of the reason why there is expected to be a shortfall, because countries have to issue these letters of authorization before that can be a CORSIA eligible offsetting unit. And again, to ensure the integrity of these offsets, CORSIA is approving registries on a separate basis to other carbon registries on a voluntary basis that have been around for a very long time. So there are currently 4 approved programs, and then for the current 2024 to 26, and then 4 additional ones from 2027 in the second phase. So how much are these offsets going to cost? This is some price projections from different reports showing the price of offsets ranging from 1814 up to the highest 85. So this is just a projection what they are expecting for offsets, and as you can see, there's a wide variation between different reports and different organizations. So where does SAF come in? So we talk about SAF, but what actually under CORSIA, it's called CORSIA eligible fuels, not SAF. So Operators, airlines, are entitled to claim emission reductions from fuels that are meeting the defined sustainability criteria and are certified by an approved certification scheme. So only then are they called CORSIA eligible fuels. And these include SAF, as we know it, but this will also include lower carbon aviation fuels, ALCAF, which is fossil-based fuels coming out of a existing petroleum refinery that have taken steps to reduce the emissions through carbon capture or renewable hydrogen, etc. So it's broader than just what we know as SAF. So these are all the documents that you can access from the ICAO website, the link there at the bottom, and this sets out the sustainability framework, which are the sustainability certification schemes, what are the sustainability criteria, the default life cycle emissions, and the LCA methodology. So these are all have all the rules and regulations. So importantly, it has its own sustainability themes, a list of 14 different ones that must all be shown and demonstrated before it can be approved as sustainable. Then there are currently only 3 sustainability certification schemes. These are third-party bodies that will verify the sustainability. So if you are a SAF producer, you have to apply to either RSB, the Roundtable on Sustainable Materials, ISCC, International Sustainability Carbon Credits, I think, and Class NK, which is in Japan. It was a third one, but currently most ones are certified or approved through RSB and ISCC. And so the emissions of your specific SAF or eligible fuel must be verified either through the default emissions under the CORSIA regulations or through a life cycle analysis, and there must be chain of custody traceability. So these schemes have to verify that everything is above board, from your feedstock supply chain to the production of the fuels and then delivery of the fuels. So life cycle emissions is the basis for determining these emissions reduction. And what a life cycle means is that you look at the entire pathway or supply chain from the original feedstock cultivation, the transport, the conversion in the SAF production facility, again the transport and distribution at the airport. And what we have is under CORSIA, a core life cycle value, which is determined by CORSIA, the Cape Environmental Committee, and they determine these default values to make it easier to set a basic value there. So if you are a SAF producer using a specific feedstock, you can go to those default columns and use that to calculate the carbon intensity of your SAF. Or if you think that yours is better than what it says in there, you can actually calculate your actual life cycle values using the methodology based in the regulations. Then there's also the issue of the induced land use change or even direct land use change, where CORSIA determines default values and you cannot go and adjust that. That is sort of cast in stone in the CORSIA documents. But this is how the carbon intensity of the SAF or ALCAF is determined. So the CORSIA defaults, and this is from an older paper, so there have been some changes, but this is just a good graph to show you. And these are just the core values. So indirect land use change or direct land use change is not calculated here. And this is very, very interesting to go and look at how they compare. Here you will see the technologies, here you will see the feedstocks, and here is a classification as a residue, a waste, a main product, byproduct, co-product, and NBC for non-biogenic content, for municipal solid waste. So it just shows you the contribution. So the green being the feedstock cultivation. So you'll see where we are looking at crops. This is quite substantial. Then the blue is the production of the feedstock to fuel, which is the next biggest contributor. So this just gives you an idea of which parts of the life cycle contribute the most. And then if you want to reduce the actual emissions of your pathway, you can see where the reduction will make the biggest impact. Then the other important aspect is this chain of custody proof of sustainability. So record keeping from the original farm or the generation of the waste right up until it goes into the airline has to be demonstrated through records. So so that you can track exactly where it comes from. So for waste, let's say for example used cooking oil. If used cooking oil is collected from a restaurant, the restaurant can have a self-declaration, but it has to be some form of form or report completed by the restaurant to say, this is how much used cooking oil I have supplied to this collector. And similarly with crops and everything, there has to be record keeping right throughout to show how much and how it moved down the line to ensure the sustainability. Now we come to the actual offset obligations and how these SAFs or CORSIA eligible fuels can be used to reduce the offset requirements. So how does this happen? If an airline purchases SAF or eligible fuels, they can use their purchase records as demonstrating that they've purchased this, and that will give them the right to deduct it off their obligation. And the life cycle emissions determines the carbon intensity, but that's all recorded as part of those documentation. And the sustainability is proved. So they have to have verified CORSIA eligible fuels. Now, if an airline buys CORSIA eligible fuels and they use it on a domestic flight, they can use that to claim or to offset their obligations under CORSIA, provided that, for example, it cannot be used to reduce the emissions of the country, because domestic flight emissions fall under emissions from the country, not under ICAO. And then those emission reductions are deducted from the final offsetting requirements at the end of each 3-year compliance period. So let's just do a quick calculation. So I took 2 examples, one based on a jet fuel price of sort of last year and a more recent one. So jet fuel used to be around $750 per ton US dollars, and this is just illustrative to show you. So for each ton of jet fuel that you burn, you produce 3.16 tons of CO2. If you buy heifer SAF from used cooking oil at $2,500 per ton, the price premium is $1,750. This gives you a 75% life cycle emission reduction. So each ton of SAF that you buy avoids 2.37 tons of CO2. And if you take that 1,750 and you divide it by the 2.37, what it will tell you is each ton of CO2 cost basically the airline, $738, which is then about 15 times more expensive than an offset at $50 per ton, still well above even aggressive voluntary carbon market prices. So the question is that I put earlier on, do you buy offsets or do you buy SAF? So SAF is more expensive than offsets, well above the price of offsets. So when will it become competitive to buy SAF? So as we've seen, offsets can become severely constrained if there isn't enough supply. And if you have strong policy support for SAF, which essentially will reduce that price premium, this will reduce the carbon abatement cost for the airline. Now let's look at a current jet fuel price of 1,500. So now the price premium is only $1,000 per ton, and therefore the carbon abatement cost is only $422 per ton, which is still 8 times more expensive than a $50 per ton offset. But so it very much depends on the cost of jet fuel, a cost of policies, and the availability of CORSIA eligible units. And this basically just sets out the comparison. Offsets, we can reduce emissions, but it's an accounting-based reduction. It doesn't actually directly reduce emissions in aviation because it's not reducing the emissions from combustion in the jet fuel. It's emission reductions from purchasing cooking stoves running on biofuel in Africa, or forest planting projects, or whatever. So there's a huge difference, and the offsets are going to be at a lower cost, probably for I don't know, a long time, unless CORSIA can elevate the prices through making it more difficult, or if there's a limited supply, the price might go up substantially. But there's sort of this idea that offsets are a bit of greenwashing. And so airlines who don't want to be seen due to public perception as greenwashing may then decide to rather produce or buy SAF, even if it's at a higher price. But again, what we see is that there isn't a lot of SAF available, and the production volumes are increasing quite slowly. So this is really difficult for airlines. And just to throw another issue in here, CORSIA, ICAO does not actually have the capacity to enforce CORSIA. Each individual country that belongs to ICAO that has approved CORSIA has to put in place domestic legislation to enforce CORSIA, and most countries haven't done that yet. So in January 2028, if there isn't compliance, it's not clear what will happen, because ICAO, as a United Nations body, has no power to enforce it. So countries have to put penalties in place, but what if airlines are just not doing it? So that is an added complication. And, offsets were originally, the idea was that it was only transitional for a period of time. But what we have to realize is, if we cannot get 65% of the emission reductions with SAF, offsets may have to become a bigger part, but the availability of offsets are definitely going to become a significant problem. So, is CORSIA effective to drive SAF development? At this stage, yes, CORSIA does increase the cost of using conventional jet fuel because it generates these offset obligations for airlines. So in theory, it should make SAF more economically attractive to airlines. But CORSIA does not actually mandate SAF as such. It only tries to create an economic pressure for decarbonization. So that's why it's called a market-based mechanism. But if the offset prices are very low, it may or may not translate into increased SAF production capacity. And from a pure cost standpoint, what you can see is that airlines will likely buy offsets. It really will depend also on the public perception and how airlines want to be perceived from their customers in terms of, are they doing something real to reduce emissions, or are they just, greenwashing? So even while we are trying to ensure the integrity of these offsets, there is that public perception that it's maybe just greenwashing. So that's really the final comments and conclusions from me. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to contact me.
Thank you so much, Susan. Yeah, thanks for that, because I had I wasn't aware that there was so short on offsets globally, I guess. And those
Yeah,
two
there are a
examples
lot
that
of offsets, but it's the fact that countries have to approve these offsets. And the problem with the fact that it's only really due by beginning of 2028, I think there isn't that pressure and there's not that realization. And as I said, most countries haven't implemented CORSIA. Even when I was doing the work in India, they say, well, we've approved CORSIA, but the reality is they have to create domestic legislation.
Do you know if Canada has enforced CORSIA? Do we have any legislation for that?
I am not sure. I'll have to check. I'm not sure if it's in place yet. I'm sure Transport Canada is working on it, but yeah, it has to be in substantive legislation. Otherwise, there's no enforcement mechanism.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and one of my questions was going to be, is the offset or SAF data going to be made public? But now, according to your dates, if they have until, let's say, 2028 for the first phase, then if I wanted to, let's say, research this, I would still kind of have to wait even maybe later than 2028, correct?
Yeah, but even then, the intention is not that specific airline transactions will ever be published. They'll be sort of generic data, so you won't be able to see which airline, because there are some competitive issues at stake.
Okay. Do you think they would it be like a sector data, or maybe country data?
Well, the obligation is on the airlines. So the state participates, but it's the airlines because it's based on the actual flights. So the airlines have to buy the offsets. So I don't know how it will translate into state, because if you have a state that's not participating because they are exempted, but their registered airline flies international flights, there is still some kind of offset obligation that is incurred. So yeah.
Yeah, and another question that we often get is, is there a possibility of using CORSIA certified fuel on, stacked with BC LCFS or CFR? And we've heard that they're still looking into it. So this will have to be resolved.
You should be able to use it for both. I know the problem is is it a double counting? Is it, you should be able to, It does become more difficult with book and claim as well, because each type of book and claim system might have different views on it or different rules. But certainly, if you're an airline, so if we look at it, the obligation for fuel supply, say in BC or under the Canada Clean Fuel Regulation, is on the fuel supplier, not on the airline. So, you know, in some cases there might be an overlap, but so they are addressing different things altogether.
Okay.
Because there's different obligations. If you say, even with the airline, the emissions generated from burning the fuel, but then companies can also buy scope 3 emissions, which is completely separate from the scope 1 emissions of the airline.
So in theory, they should be able to.
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I mean, I guess it remains to be seen, right, as the program rolls out, and see how everything goes. Well, thank you so much, Susan.
Thanks, Juliana.
Yeah, and thank you to all of you, and I hope you enjoyed our presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.